People's Radio United.
Who was Kevin Cooper before? Not, I know now he's a man in prison, falsely convicted, but who was he before? Like, before the murder and all that. What was Kevin Cooper?
Okay, Kevin was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 1958. After 2 months, his mother put him up for adoption, and he went to an orphanage. And 4 months later, he was adopted by Melvin and Esther Cooper. Melvin was a captain in the Pittsburgh Fire Department and something of a disciplinarian. Kevin recalls his father, his adopted father, Melvin, taking a thick leather belt to him as early as age 5.
Ooh.
This caused Kevin to run away a few times as a small child, like a 7-year-old, and that type of thing. He in the 5th grade, they did a diagnosis of Kevin, and they found he had an average IQ, but suffered from attention deficit disorder. Plus, he was impulsive and hyperactive. The analysis failed to diagnose his dyslexia. So that was a major impediment going forward for the educators not to know that he couldn't read properly.
Yeah, wow.
At age 12, he ran away from home. Again, and stole his adopted father's credit cards and that kind of thing. And the next year, they put him in some kind of a juvenile detention after that episode. And the next year, when he was 13, he escaped. This would be he tried to escape from his adopted father. Now, this long pattern that would remain with Kevin for the rest of his time, until he was convicted of this terrible crime. He started his life of escape. He left the juvenile detention facility in a stolen car, and he wrecked it. He was severely injured, multiple fractures, concussions, and a brain injury known as CSF rhino ray. And he had nasal leakage of cerebral fluids, indicating rupture of membranes around his brain. All of his front teeth were knocked out. He spent 27 days in the hospital. And while he was there, the medical report said that he was agitated, combative, and uncooperative, which they diagnosed as symptoms indicating traumatic brain injury of a moderate to marked severity. So Kevin now had this very severe brain injury. He was already learning disabled and dyslexic and that type of thing. And his prospects going forward were pretty dim. He started coping with this by committing more and more serious types of crimes. He was charged 2 years later with popping an engine in an engine out of a car in an attempt to steal the car, and then he resisted arrest. Pretty soon he was serving a 1 to 2 year sentence for first-time offenders for burglaries of a home. He was in a minimum security state prison. He was out on work release when he walked off the detail and escaped again. He was recaptured, and he was now sent to a maximum security state prison in Pennsylvania. 11 months later, he was paroled. But he was arrested and convicted twice again for burglary and given added time for parole violations. When he was released in 1982, he was placed on 10 years probation. His last arrest in Pennsylvania for a string of three burglaries was in June of 1982. He was just getting into trouble over and over again. Now, while awaiting trial for these three burglaries, a court-appointed psychiatrist assigned Kevin to go to a state hospital called Mayview State Hospital, a minimum security state institution, where they do a mental, psychological analysis and mental evaluation. At a competency hearing in September to determine whether or not Kevin was competent to stand trial, he was declared mentally incompetent due to his experiencing suicidal auditory delusions. So he was allowed to stay at Mayview for treatment, but he didn't stay very long. Mayview is located in an upscale suburb of 35 miles from Pittsburgh. And one night, and this is a place where they really try to work with people and give them breaks. They have all kinds of activities for them. And one activity was bowling. And one night in the bowling alley, Kevin climbed through the window and escaped again. And as before he escaped, he stole the driver's license of a fellow inmate named David Trotman. He then followed some railroad tracks to a housing division in this upscale suburb called St. Clair, and he saw a couple of cars in a driveway. He tried to hotwire them, but he didn't succeed, so he broke into that house and tried to find the car keys. And while he was inside, a 17-year-old girl who was a friend of that family came up, parked her car and came up the front walk and knocked on the door, and Kevin told her the friend she'd come to see was upstairs, but then he pulled her into the house, hit her in the face with a camera that he was in the process of stealing, and then abducted her, forced her back to her car, made her get down on the passenger side floor with her face toward the floor, and he drove her the 35 miles to a secluded park. Now this is 10 o'clock at night, to a secluded park in Pittsburgh, where he then had her get out of the car and left her there with I think she only had on at that time a skirt. He left her there, and she went walking out of the park and called the first house she went to. They let her call the cops, and she told them that this man had abducted her, kidnapped her, hit her with a camera, that he'd made her crouch down on the floor, etc., and that he raped her. So all three of these charges, a major APB was put out for, this black male, and all three charges. Now, Kevin, after this, he went up to New York for 2 weeks by bus, and went up to New York for 2 weeks, and then took a bus to Las Vegas. There he met a woman, and he began a relationship with her, and she lived actually in Hollywood, California. She became pregnant, and later in 1983, after the Chino Hills murders were committed, she actually had a son, bore a son. So Kevin is a father. In Hollywood, Kevin briefly worked in telemarketing, and he sold some marijuana on the side. But before long, he reverted to burglary. His conviction for 2 burglaries in Los Angeles landed him at the California Institute for Men in Chino. And that's a place where anybody arrested in Southern California is sent to be for determination of what kind of a level prison they should be sent to eventually.
Yeah.
Now, Kevin was arrested under the name David Trotman. So when the pre-sentencing report, the parole officer looked up David Trotman's record. He had no record in California because he'd never been in California. And Kevin was mistakenly, even though he told this person that his real name was Kevin Cooper, she went on the David Trotman information and assigned him a minimum security clearance at Chino Hills, and he was awaiting. He was going to be shipped out in a couple of days to a minimum security prison in Southern California. And on the second day after this classification, he did what he always liked to do. He escaped, and this escape, which he pulled off in the morning around 10 o'clock. He ended up about 3 miles away, walking at night after he hid out in a big old, big parking lot for semis. He hid out in one of the semi trucks during the day while everybody's looking for him. And then at night, he made his way down off of a highway, like the shoulder of the highway, a lot of water and stuff like that. And he finally made his way into Chino Hills, this section of California that's known for it's a horse country area where not everybody, but many of the people there raise horses, and particularly Arabian horses. And he walks up this very steep hill, and he sees there's a garage light on, and the garage door is slightly open, open at the bottom. And he goes around to the front door and knocks. Nobody answers. So he goes and lets himself in this garage. Now this garage, this house is 125 feet directly down, steeply down from the home that Doug and Peggy Ryan live in above their Chino Hills ranch house.
Yeah.
So that's how Kevin, from all the way from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to Hollywood, etc., ends up in this abandoned house, 125 feet below the Ryan's house, and sets in motion this nightmare that will consume all of his life up until today.